Hello, welcome to another Tweedy Pubs video. I'm in Kilburn today, a little bit off the beaten track, but there is one absolute gem of a pub that is behind me right now that is my main reason for coming here. However, I thought while I'm in the area, as usual, I'm going to visit a handful of pubs and see what else Kilburn has to offer. Pub number one, the Black Lion, which it seems doesn't open until 4 o'clock, so I'm going to have to come back later. Finally, cheers from the Black Lion, meant to be pub number one. The way round I actually ended up doing things, it was pub number 5, but whatever, here I am. Let's take a look at the exterior first. Apologies in advance for this odd mixture of midday gloomy pictures and actually slightly brighter 4 p.m. pictures, but that's the way it went. The building dates to 1898. And the architect was Robert Alexander Lucock. It's a listed building, and also it's included on CAMRA's list of historic pub interiors. We've seen a lot of these stylistic elements in turn of the century pubs before. Red brick, but with white stone and or stucco dressings, particularly around the windows. Also there is a balustraded parapet, a corner turrel. I think it's a turrel rather than a turret because it doesn't go all the way down to the ground. There is this sort of projecting bit up above the corner entrance there that has a possibly copper roof and a weather vane on top of it. The ground floor is our old favourite combination of pink and grey granite, which was very popular in that late Victorian era. Of course, the classic pairing is lavicite and Swedish red, which could be the case here. Within the pilasters there are 2 tones, a lighter grey for the main stem and a darker grey for the base. Within the umbrella of lavicite there are several different types of lavicite. There is marina pearl lavicite and emerald pearl lavicite, and they do have slightly different tones and shades to them, so it's possible we're seeing 2 different examples of some of those here. Those pilasters have Corinthian capitals, and above those capitals are corbels that have stucco work showing a black lion's head, in keeping with the name of the pub. The pink granite, or reddish granite, possibly Swedish, forms an arcade housing all of the windows and the entrances along the frontage. The original etched windows along the main road, along Kilburn High Road, have been lost, but along the side, which is now a kind of beer garden seating area, you can still see some of those. The doors have these carved pediments above them. There are 3 different versions of it, and they're all different. They're all in different styles corresponding to the different entrances. First of all, there's the saloon, the posher bit of the pub, then the private bar, which I think was always the area that was sort of invitation only if you happen to be a close personal friend of the landlord or a regular maybe. And then slightly enigmatically on the corner here is an entrance that is just labelled bar, a note that has the plainest of all of those 3 pediments. It's just a simple curved pediment. CAMRA's notes on the pub suggest that probably meant the public bar. That was the most down at heel bit of the interior space originally, but all of this pub, of course, would have been pretty opulent. Today, as is always the case, the interior has been mostly opened up, but there are at least a couple of remnants still of those partitions. So inside we have detailed notes from CAMRA in their listing for this historic pub interior. The feature that this pub is best known for is this series of 4 copper panels, and they are the work of Frederick Thomas Calcott. Interestingly, those panels actually depict scenes at another nearby pub, which we'll be seeing later on today's itinerary. That is the Bell, and in the back garden of the Bell originally were the Kilburn Wells, sort of pleasure gardens and a place for people to take the waters. And these scenes here in these copper panels depict the various entertainments and refreshments and activities that those people would have been taking part in, including bowling, drinking, eating, smoking pipes. There is one of the painting of the sign for the pub. We've actually encountered Frederick Thomas Calcott's work before in some of these pub videos. Most famously, he contributed some of the copper panels to the Blackfriar, and although not officially attributed, the copper panels at the Prince Edward in Holloway, I think could also be the handiwork of Frederick Calcott. Around much of the interior is this elaborate frieze, which CAMRA's notes describe as Florentine. Above that is a similarly ornate ceiling with gilded detailing. The bar counter is apparently original from that 1898 rebuild. It's fielded panelling interspersed with fluted pilasters. The bar back, also original, is all scrolls and pediments, and the top part blends in with that Florentine frieze. Some remnants of the original partitions do survive, with more intricate carving and etched glass panels, although apparently at least one of these partitions has been moved from its original location. It's an incredibly sumptuous interior. I think it's worth the trip out here to Kilburn for this pub alone. Moreover, Gary Eats has been here, and I think he sat in a pretty similar spot to where I'm sitting now and gave the Sunday roast a particularly high score. Was it 9.5 out of 10 or something? He didn't give much commentary on the granite on the exterior, but I guess that's not really his thing, and he does seem to have 200 and something thousand subscribers, so it's obviously working for him. Let's take a look at the history of the Black Lion. The oldest written records I could find for it are the usual Sunfire Office insurance records dating back to 1792. I get the sense that it likely isn't significantly older than that, because if we look at Kilburn on John Rock's map of 1746, there are only really a handful, perhaps a dozen at most, buildings comprising Kilburn at that point in time. And we already know that at least one of the other pubs we're going to be seeing later did exist at that point in history. I'm a little sceptical that there could have been more than one for a settlement of this size. The earliest newspaper mention I could find of it is from 1815, and the 1890s Ordnance Survey map shows the old outline of the pub just a few years prior to it being rebuilt. And if we compare that map to the mid-1900s OS map, we can see that the overall footprint became somewhat larger with that rebuild. Today I think it's possibly an independent pub. It's not obviously part of any chain. It's somewhat food leaning. I think the weekday offering is more Indian food, I believe, and at the weekend there is that much lauded Sunday roast that Gary Eats raved about. I went for a half of a best bitter with a handwritten label whose name I can't remember, but I'll try and get a shot of the hand pumps. Pub number 2, and I'm not doing very well here, also doesn't seem to be open yet, the Sir Colin Campbell. Okay, let's try this again. Cheers from the Sir Colin Campbell. I'm sorry that I'm next to a busy main road and there's constantly cars, buses, lorries, etc. idling their engines outside, so the sound quality isn't going to be great. To my slight surprise, this building actually gets a mention in Bridget Cherry and Nicolaus Pevner's Guide to the Buildings of London, and they describe the building, or this run of buildings that the pub forms part of, as late Georgian to possibly early Victorian. It has a tiled pub frontage. You can see some of that behind me right now, and you can see in some places there are at least 3 different tones of tiles, this sort of burgundy colour, an orangey colour, and a sort of pale salmony pinky kind of colour. The pub sign up above still has a kind of circular reference to its days as a Watney's pub, Watney, Coombe and Reed. Not much is written about the interior. There is a brief mention on Camera's website that it has some interwar fittings. I wonder if they're possibly referring to some of these wood frames that form part of the bar back. I suppose they could be interwar. They're relatively plain, so it's a little bit hard to identify from the style of the carving. The bar counter, again, hard to pin down to a particular era. There is actually a nice bit of stained glass at the back of the pub. The hand pumps on the bar, those fox hunting scenes, that's something from Tetley's, and we saw those as well, I think possibly of a similar era. I think 1960s hand pumps at the Coach and Horses in Soho. So the name here, Sir Colin Campbell, it's not unique. There are a few pubs dotted around the country with this name. He was a military commander who distinguished himself at, I believe, the Relief of Lucknow and the Battle of Balaclava, part of the Crimean War. Elsewhere in the UK where this pub name appears, it was the case that the original landlord had served under Sir Colin Campbell in one of his many campaigns. That's possibly the case here, but in my brief bit of digging I couldn't find a clear reference to that. The earliest record of the pub seems to be as a beer house in the 1881 census, and we have the London Wiki website to thank for this. I suspect that the proprietor at that time, given that there weren't any substantial earlier records, William Hewing, actually started the business, and it may be that he had some connection to Sir Colin Campbell. That does put this in the slightly unusual position of being broadly an Irish pub that is located here in England but is named after a Scotsman. I'm not exactly sure at which point in history this became an Irish pub. The Irish community here in Kilburn started to emerge mostly in the mid-20th century. For a time, Kilburn was described as Ireland's 33rd county, sometimes referred to as County Kilburn. Today, the pub is ran by a small pub co, which I believe only owns and manages this one pub. So it is effectively an independent pub. I went for a half of Guinness. I did notice they also had Doom Bar on the hand pumps. Pub number 3, the Kilburn Arms, formerly known as the Prince of Wales. Cheers from the Kilburn Arms. We have a pub building of very similar age to the Black Lion here, just 1 year apart, built in 1899. And it's in a roughly similar style. Lots of these pub buildings of that turn of the century period look roughly similar, predominantly built in red brick with some white stone and all stucco dressing, particularly around the windows. Another balustraded parapet, and that's interspersed with several decorative gables along the rooftop. One of those gables has the former name of the pub, the Prince of Wales. Another has the Prince of Wales feathers, including the motto Ich dien, which I think translates as I serve. Again, here we have a ground floor frontage, very typical of that late Victorian period, which blends pink or red and grey or black granite. So quite possibly, once again, here we have some combination of lavicite and Swedish red. There are stylized Corinthian capitals atop those pilasters in that pink granite there, and they have faces in them. Just one of the entrances today has the name above the door of the space it would originally have led into. That's for the saloon. That's rendered in ironwork here, and we've seen similar designs elsewhere in North London, particularly in that Crouch End pub video. It's interesting that the ironwork is not repeated above the other entrances, and I wonder if that may have been removed or replaced at some point. An essay dated, I think, 1969 that I found described the exterior of this building as a tedious piece of planner's old English good taste, with those last few words capitalised, implying a level of sarcasm. And that kind of shows the contempt that I think was felt in the 1960s for this kind of traditional pub architecture. It's interesting that at that time, the essay describes the interior of that pub as perhaps the most remarkable piece of pop design in Europe. All of that has since disappeared, but we still thankfully have some nice vestiges of the original Victorian interior. This is on camera's list of historic pub interiors, just with a 1-star rating, but there are still some nice features remaining. The bar counter today is in an unusual colour of sort of turquoise, and I think even camera calls that out in their listing with some disdain, but the shape of it is still resolutely late Victorian. So that partition dividing has some very nice carving and some etched cut glass in it, and that's a theme that is repeated in the bar back as well. There is more of that to be seen behind both sides of the bar counter. And another thing that the camera listing calls out is the door to the office, which is particularly nicely adorned with this piece of cut glass. Quite a grand, imposing vestibule here with some of the etched and cut glass in it. And then there is a larger room which feels a little bit more modern today off to one side, which could possibly, as we've seen elsewhere, be something like originally a billiards room. The pub probably originates around the 1860s or the 1870s, so the original name here, the Prince of Wales, almost certainly refers to the oldest son of Queen Victoria, Prince Albert Edward, who was eventually crowned as Edward VII. The extension at the back of the pub, now partly housing a fish and chips takeaway, has a bit of stucco carving in it showing Prince Albert Edward or King Edward VII. Like the previous pub, this is another former beer shop, possibly prior to that 1890s rebuild. It looks a bit too grand to just simply be a beer house. And the earliest record that I was able to find for it, thanks to the London wiki site, was 1871, the census there. And you can see the name of the pub, the Prince of Wales, spelled out in full at that time. Today it possibly has the feeling of an independent pub. I couldn't see any obvious branding from any of the usual suspects of pub chains. They don't seem to currently serve any real ale. I couldn't see any signs of any hand pumps on the bar. It's all keg taps, so I went for a half of Guinness and put the price down there. Pub number 4, the Cooper's Arms. Cheers from the Cooper's Arms. instinctively this looks mock Tudor to me. I guessed that it was from the interwar period, that peak of mock Tudor pub building, and on further research it turns out this was in fact a rebuild of 1926. It's a former Charrington's house, and I suspect this could be the handiwork of Sidney Clark, who was the chief architect for Charrington's during that time and did a lot of mock Tudor pubs, as well as some Neo-Georgian. Those were the two styles that you got during that era. So starting at the top, there is this large gable. On the first floor, that's where you see some of the characteristic mock Tudor timbering taking place. And perhaps the most interesting feature on the first floor for me is this bit of stucco work that shows the Cooper's Arms, the coat of arms of the Worshipful Company of Coopers. There is a chevron in the middle of the shield of that coat of arms, and the two tools that you can see there, one of those is a roin. In the middle is a roin, and that is a tool that's a bit like a plane that is used for cutting a particular kind of groove when making barrels, and the other two tools you can see either side of that are adzes, which are a kind of axe that's also used in woodwork and presumably specifically in barrel making in cooperage. On the ground floor there are glazed brick tiles, and in between those some really beautiful windows, I think, with stained glass and leaded panes, and from the outside you get a bit of a sense of some of the Charrington's era livery. In the middle it has the pub's name, the Cooper's Arms, and then to one side wines, to the other side spirits. There's also this cute top hat wearing chap logo, which I think is associated with Charrington's in that era. As always, of course, those windows are a bit better appreciated from the inside with the light shining through, and that's one of the first things you notice when you come into the pub. I think this is a beautiful interior. This is a real hidden gem and a very nicely preserved bit of 1920s pub interior. I'm surprised this didn't make it onto camera's list of historic pub interiors. There clearly have been one or two alterations over the years, but first of all, the wood panelling looks very nicely intact around the sides. It's all fielded panelling around most of the pub on the walls. There are these beautiful carved freezers that show grapevines with bunches of grapes on them. 2 layers of those, in fact, and that also continues in a small trim around the top above the bar counter. There is a similar style of fielded panelling on the bar counter to that seen on the walls. The bar counter has clearly been modified a little bit in more recent history. There is a sort of footrest that's partly carpeted, I think, and another footrest that may be missing at one side. Overall, you've got this beautiful wood panelled interior. There's some really nice kind of booth seating, bench seating built into that in various places, and it's just a really lovely effect, particularly with those stained glass windows at the front as well. Oh, I should add, it also has this very nice beer garden out the back. I couldn't find any photos of this on the web, so I wasn't sure if it had any outside space, but this is really nice. So as noted, the name here, the Cooper's Arms, relates to the Worshipful Company of Coopers, or at least with the interpretation from that 1920s stucco carving on the wall there. It's possible that an early owner or landlord of this pub may have had some affiliation, some association with that city livery company, the Worshipful Company of Coopers. I'm not sure. Once again, this is another former beer house, and the earliest written reference I could find to it is this newspaper mention of 1867. A few years later it appears in the census records. Here's one from 1871 where Henry King is the head of household at that time. Another one from 1881, still with Henry King running the pub. Today has very much an independent pub feel. There's a little bit of an Irish pub feel, but they do actually also have at least one real ale on. I know some people have mixed feelings about Doom Bar, but I'm personally really enjoying this at the moment. Nice to see a hand pump on. Very, very reasonably priced. I think for London, I'll put the price down there. Really taken with the Cooper's Arms here. Had a chat with the lady behind the bar, I assume to be the landlady, who was very chatty and friendly as well, and a beautiful, very pubby pub. Pub number 5, the Old Bell. Cheers from the Old Bell. There are written accounts of the pub having been rebuilt in 1863. Looking at the style of it, I think that's probably the building that we're looking at today. It's mostly stock brick, possibly some banding in what looks a bit like engineering brick, that darker coloured brick to me. It has these 2 turrets. I think they're probably the most striking feature of the exterior. From the front they look as though they would be hexagonal or possibly octagonal, but I think they only go around the front curves. I don't think they're also curved at the back. Some of the windows also have pointed arches. There's a slight hint of the Gothic about this, I suppose. The ground floor frontage has brown glazed tiles and what looks to be 3 entrances originally. I suspect that that whole piece of the facade was added later, sometime after that 1860s rebuild. If you take a look at the outline of the building on this 1860s Ordnance Survey map, you can see that the turrets actually project out onto the pavement at that point in time. But by the time of Gode's map of 1887, you can just about see the outline of the turrets and that kind of frontage that projects. So sometime in the 1870s or 1880s, the frontage there was added. Perhaps it's those turrets, but the whole thing has a sort of slightly defensive air about it. It looks like a little miniature castle. Much of the interior feels relatively modern today. Not sure about the bar counter. I mean, always when they're painted, it's harder to sort of imagine that they're original pieces of woodwork. It has 2 layers of fielded panelling, and it's painted over in a, a very modern pub colour, a turquoisey sort of paint job. But there is this funny little bit of partition at the side that doesn't seem to serve a huge amount of purpose today, and I wonder if that might actually be some vestige of at least an earlier pub interior layout. The bar back is currently painted in a sort of cream colour and has some turned columns, I suppose you'd call them. I think one of my favourite features on the interior is this large mirror with the pub's name in it, and that definitely has at least a few decades of age, looking at how the flecks of paint have been coming off. I would be inclined to say more mid-20th century perhaps. There is an impressively large beer garden out the back, right next to the train tracks, and thus I'm having to constantly pause the narrative to wait for trains to go past. Some accounts suggest that there has been a bell inn on this site going all the way back to 1600. I'm not going to be able to verify that, but there are pretty good records for this pub throughout the 18th century, the 1700s. Here is a mention of it in court proceedings of 1731, and here's Kilburn, or Kilbourne as it was spelt at that time, on John Rock's map of 1746. There are just a few buildings lining what we know today as Kilburn High Road, part of the longer stretch of Edgware Road, which in turn is part of the Roman road, Watling Street. I think the bell would probably have been one of these buildings on the corner here with this lane called Kilburn Abbey Lane. Kilburn Abbey, or Priory, was a victim of the dissolution of the monasteries in 1537. Here's a sketch of how it may have looked in 1722. This drawing from 1750 of the bell appears in Walter Thornbury's Old and New London, Volume 5. The location of Kilburn Wells was behind the bell, as reported in this 1890s book about London's pleasure gardens. In the latter half of the 18th century, this became a fashionable destination for people to come and take the waters. It was a chalybeate spring, an iron-rich spring that was believed particularly to be a very effective hangover cure. And I suppose the closest modern equivalent we have to that is people drinking iron brew the morning after. It was also a popular spot nearby here for duelling, and in 1792 a duel was held in a neighbouring field between the Earl of Lauderdale and General Benedict Arnold, following a slight that the Earl of Lauderdale had made about the General in the House of Lords, accusing him of apostasy, with the Earl of Lauderdale refusing to take the first shot because the General had been slighted. I think that's what it means by injured here rather than physically injured. The General graciously accepted the offer, took aim, missed, and then presumably they then shook hands, made up, and went their separate ways. Again, this has a bit of a feel of an independent pub, or at least a pub that is not part of any of the big usual suspect chains. They had London Pride and Hobgoblin Gold on the bar. I slightly regrettably went for the Hobgoblin Gold, that I then realised is actually a little bit grapefruity. Probably should have stuck to the London Pride. Right, well that is going to be it for today from Kilburn. I do think, as I say, the Black Lion is very much worth the visit all by itself, but I also thought the Cooper's Arms was a bit of a hidden gem there. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.